So when it comes to the war in Ukraine, the story has been relatively simple, relatively predictable. Russia claims it advances slowly, taking one hail bale at a time. Ukraine defends and often retakes that land, and the front barely moves. But over the past few weeks, something significant is changing. Ukraine hasn't necessarily suddenly gotten much stronger, but Russia's suddenly got more blind. And that does change a lot, because this wasn't caused by a new system, or a sudden breakthrough strategy, or a dramatic influx of Western aid. It is coming from something much more fragile. A system, one single system being switched off. And when that system disappears, the battlefield didn't just shift, it's largely destabilized for Russia. Russian units are losing coordination, drone strikes are being slowed, communication breaking down, and for the first time in months, Ukrainian forces are finding consistent gaps, real gaps, and they're moving. Now, most people will look at this and focus on the surface level explanation. It's better down to better tactics, better timing, a temporary Russian mistake. But that misses the deeper point here. Because what is actually happening, and what it reveals, is something more uncomfortable. This war is no longer being decided primarily by firepower. It's being decided by systems, and more importantly, by the single individuals in some cases, and who controls them. Because if one decision made far from the battlefield can suddenly blind one side entirely and give the other openings, then that balance of power isn't just sitting in Kyiv or Moscow. It's sitting somewhere else entirely, and not even in DC. So in this video, I want to break down this in three parts. What actually is happening when we say Russia has lost access to this system? Why that disruption matters far more than people might be assuming? And the much bigger implications. What this tells us about how modern warfares are really being fought and what could happen as we go further in 2026.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we look at the strategy behind geopolitics, economics, and international relations. And this time we are returning to the front lines of the Russia-Ukraine war, taking a moment's reprieve from the Iranian one. Now, before getting into it, I want your take on this. Do you think wars, including Ukraine, are being decided more and more by the AI or technological aspects as it is about good old manpower, about those who behind the front lines controls the systems? Because depending upon how you answer that question, basically determines how you interpret everything that we're about to break down. Now let's get into it. When people think about modern warfare, we picture something relatively traditional, perhaps. Troops, tanks, airstrikes. Certainly that's what images in the situation in the Middle East would depict. But Ukraine has been fighting a very different kind of war for years. A war where information is much more significant than firepower, where drones constantly scan the battlefield and where the side that can see and communicate has that advantage. We know the role that social media has played in making the reality of warfare that much more accessible and therefore that much more personal to us. It's sort of how when mainstream broadcasters first started airing images, live TV of the Gulf War, many people look at this as the next phase in the modernity and direction of modern warfare. And so for a long time, Russia has built exactly that advantage using specifically Starlink of all systems. You see, despite sanctions, Russian forces have managed to acquire terminals through intermediaries and integrate them deeply into battlefield operations. Commanders could watch live drone feeds, coordinate units in real time, and direct attacks instantly. In effect, they had built a digital nervous system across the front, and that system made them far more effective, well, until suddenly it disappeared. Indeed, this has been one of the critical elements that has allowed Russia sort of to catch up, or in some ways relatively overtake Ukraine in the innovation and leadership of drone usage and other battlefield tactics. So what's actually changed? Well, in February, SpaceX implemented what's known as a white system. Only approved terminals could access its network. Ukrainian ones stayed online, but Russian ones didn't. And that impact was immediate, but relatively uncovered because of what happened in Iran. Russian units lost access to real-time communication, live drone feeds, and coordination. According to Ukrainian soldiers, they were suddenly pushed back to something resembling Cold War-era communications. For a long time that I've been covering this war, I've been very aware and paying attention to the Soviet doctrine mindset that the Russian military seemed to use. Indeed, the initial invasion of Ukraine resembled that very much, being led by the security services instead of the standalone army, somewhat assuming that the Ukrainian people would just welcome them with open arms, which, well, we clearly know how that went down. This sort of idea of Cold War relics may sound like a technical detail, but on a modern battlefield, it is absolutely critical, because without connectivity, everything slows down. Detection becomes less useful, response becomes delayed, coordination breaks down, and the gap between seeing a target and acting on it is so crucial. Ukrainian soldiers have described exactly that, where previously, if they were spotted, waves of drones would follow immediately, instantaneously. But now there's quite a large delay, big gaps. Therefore, there's time to move, time to survive, time to counterattack. And Ukraine has been exploiting that significantly over the past few weeks. So why does this matter so much? Well, this isn't just about, say, fewer drones. It was about the collapse of the system that entitles the Russian ability to overwhelm Ukrainian targets. Modern warfare, like many things, runs on layers: surveillance, communication, execution. So remove one layer and the others start to fail. Russian commanders could no longer guide units effectively. Infantry lost direction, drone operators lose targets. And critically, Ukrainian forces can intercept radio communications, something they couldn't do when Russia was operating through these encrypted satellite links. Another illustration of the first days of the war, when we could basically listen in entirely on Russia's open communication channels, and many conscripts or younger soldiers communicating with their families at home about the fact that they didn't even realize they were in Ukraine. They thought that they were in a training exercise in Crimea. And so this loss of encryption has created another advantage, not just disruption, but visibility. Ukrainian intelligence units have begun hearing Russian plans in advance, be them movements, routes, objectives, sometimes even 24 hours ahead. And that changes the battlefield completely. It changes the strategic picture. Ukraine is no longer just reacting. It's able to anticipate and proactively determine the direction. There's, of course, a human element to this as well. When that system disappears, control breaks down, and Russian units weren't just less efficient, they're now more isolated, less informed, more uncertain, in some cases completely cut off, and that does wonders for the loss of morale. For months, Russian commanders have tightly controlled units, tracking positions, verifying movement, directing action in real time, something that hasn't been the case in earlier cases of the conflict. And suddenly that control is gone. And that matters because control is therefore often mistaken for strength. But when it disappears, what's left underneath can look entirely different: confusion, delays, in some cases panic, and the retreat. Ukrainian forces exploit that even harder, and we're seeing that begin to be seen in notable gains on the ground. Indeed, Ukraine's advances haven't been massive, only around 150 square miles, mostly fields and small villages. That's not the point. The point is timing and momentum, which has largely been on the Russian side, albeit incrementally. These were Ukraine's biggest gains in almost 2 years, and they came precisely when Russia's system of control has destabilized. Now, we can't obviously mean correlation means causation, but Ukrainian units pushing into these weak points, attacking rear positions, and creating confusion does reinforce that. At times, Russian forces have believed that they were facing larger breakthroughs than actually existed. And in the fog of war, they intercepted communications. Ukrainian forces could hear this panic, orders to retreat, calls to abandon positions. That isn't just a tactical shift, it's a psychological one, and increases the momentum for the Ukrainians, which in these highly unpredictable moments is everything. Now, Russia is able to adapt, but not completely. The advantage isn't permanent because Russia has the ability to lay communication cables, use alternative networks, and turn to domestic or even Chinese satellite systems. Coordination does return, albeit in erratic ways, and Ukraine estimates suggest Russia has recovered around some percent of its capability, but not all of it. And the harder it is to get as the Ukrainians exploit it. Starlink wasn't just one option, it was the most effective one. Cheap, reliable, scalable. But that's the key point here. In modern warfare, the most effective system isn't always the most advanced. It's the one that works at scale, it's the one that can easily be replicated, and is most amenable to different environments. But within all of this, there is a deeper shift here. War is a system problem. because this is where the bigger lesson is. Wars are no longer decided purely by the military strength. They're decided by the entirety of all the elements combined, which is what I'd like to emphasize on this channel. Communication, data, connectivity, but of course those who control them and so can disrupt them. Because when you remove a key system like Starlink, even a powerful army, so presumed, it suddenly looks fragile. Russia hasn't run out of troops or lost its weapons, but it's lost coordination. And that is the biggest thing to reclaim and to reinforce again. But there's another even more uncomfortable layer, which is this wasn't done by government, NATO, or Ukraine itself. It was done by the private company, or specifically one private individual, Elon Musk. So that raises, as usual, the bigger question. Who controls the battlefield, and how much can we consciously and comfortably put in the hands of a single individual, given especially how we know about his opinions of Zelensky or the war in Ukraine and tacit sympathies perhaps for Russia? That power can be no longer held by states, but by corporations and the ultra uber wealthy. It can be shared, but it can also be taken away and monopolized. And that's a real new vulnerability. Privatization of certain aspects of warfare. Russia didn't just rely on Starlink, it depended on something it didn't control, and that's even more dangerous. Modern militaries are increasingly defined not by military firepower, but by the dependency on networks, infrastructure, AI, systems that can all be quite easily manipulated. Once that dependency, therefore, is exposed, the illusion of control collapses very quickly, and regardless of what's being said or done in Moscow, including the ideas of a coup, which, as I've said, are overblown in my opinion, well, does it even matter what Putin says if Musk controls such an important consideration of this? It doesn't work in isolation. With all that in mind, we also have to put this into the wider context, because whilst Russia is losing gains, Ukraine is making them. It has launched large-scale drone strikes into Russia, which, because of the disruptions to its technological side, have been unable to be intercepted as well. Hundreds of drones in a single night. Many people's estimations, the largest that Ukraine has targeted into Russia since the full-scale invasion. Diplomatically, negotiations continue to stall, the global attention is divided, and Russia has been attempting to leverage its relationship or unique relations with the Iranians as a peace broker. So it's not all about the local battlefield as always, it's about the much larger strategic contest and how quickly that balance of power can shift. And therefore, what does this actually tell us? Well, it tells us that the nature of war, not just the war in Ukraine, but that of Iran, is changing. Advantage doesn't always come from more firepower. Sometimes it comes from disrupting the system your opponent depends on, or simply lying about the true capabilities, as we've seen with the Iranians' capacity to threaten Diego Garcia with rockets that can fly more than double the range that they claimed or publicly stated that they could. And that's a significant consideration for anyone involved in conflict about the fog of war and what their opponents are truly capable or not capable of. In Ukraine's case, the gains are mattering significantly, but not because of the territory itself. They matter because of what enabled them, a sudden collapse in connectivity, this breakdown in coordination, and a system failure that Ukraine is able to exploit not just on the battlefield within its own country, but also further at home in Russia, where many Russians still don't feel the true nature of this conflict. Modern warfare sees control often looking like strength until it disappears. And when it does, you can quickly see underneath that there's something much more fragile, that the military depends significantly on the political and, of course, the economy. Russia isn't suddenly weak or collapsing, as I say, but for more and more moments, it looks ever more susceptible to these bigger strategic fault lines. It's a demonstration that wars today are fought as much by the mundane technological, robotic elements as they are by the explosive and damaging weapons aspect. But if that's true, then the balance of power in modern warfare may not sit where we think it does, not even in the capitals or in the armies, but in this invisible online infrastructure that connects all of us together. But with that in mind, everyone, that's it from me. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do give it a like, consider subscribing, and if you want to support me further, you can find links in the description or in the pinned comment to do so. And be sure to check out this video next about the situation in Iran and what it means for the global oil and economy. Take care.